In this video, I'll take a longer, more considered look at Livius Andronicus and his Odussia, the Latin language remake of Homer's Odyssey. And this time, we'll take a look at the text itself, and there'll be no more trolling quotes from 1st century meanies like Cicero. Just wait till the end, when we'll see the tables turned and the Greeks crap on the Romans. Literally. Welcome to Ancient Classics. The Odussia is the earliest attested Latin epic. It was written in the 3rd century BCE by Livius Andronicus, who by most ancient accounts was a former slave, a Greek speaker originally from Tarentum, who was enslaved by a Roman family, served as a tutor, and eventually freed, going on to translate or adapt Greek tragedies and Homer's Odyssey itself. But is it fair to call the Odussia a translation at all? That's a question I'll come back to later. But let's start where it all begins, the first line. Now this line comes down to us thanks to Aulus Gellius, who quotes it in Book 18 of his Attic Nights, when he's nerding out about the Latin word insecanda, and whether it should be spelt with a C or a QU. In the library, I found a manuscript of Livius Andronicus of undoubted antiquity, entitled Odyssey, in which the first line contained this word without the letter U. Virum mihi camena insece versutum. This is, as Aulus Gellius perhaps unnecessarily informs us, a close translation of the first words of Homer's Odyssey, andromoi enepe musa polutropon. Livius takes the first 5 words of the Odyssey and translates them more or less literally, using the same word order and grammatical constructions, albeit swapping round the 3rd and 4th words. Virum mihi, a man, to me, is a flat-out conventional translation of andromoi. Just like Homer, therefore, Livius opens his Odyssey with the essential term for an adult male, virum, whence virile, virtue, and so on. Much the same vibe as Homer's andra. Homer's imperative verb enepe, speak or tell, becomes in Latin insece, albeit its place is swapped in the line. The word insece is the subject of Aulus Gellius' little discussion. It's a fairly unusual word, which is why Aulus Gellius is geeking out on it, and it might even be an epic neologism, modelled in some respects on the Greek enepe. But if this word is indeed inspired by the Greek, then that would actually be something of an anomaly in Livius. You see, as Feeney and others have pointed out, it's notable that Livius does not attempt to Greekify his Latin. Most of the artificiality in his language seems actually to be an attempt to add an archaizing Latin character to the poetry, or to transmute Greek conventions into a Latin format, i.e. his handling of patronymics. But Livius rarely or never forces Greek vocabulary or grammar into the Latin. Well, that might seem curious because it became a trope for Latin epic poets to import certain Greekisms into their verse, Greek vocab, Greek-inspired declinations, and grammatical features such as the accusative of respect. So it's notable that, with the possible exception of insece, the OG of Latin epic, though a Greek native speaker himself, should try so hard to write in pure strain, albeit artificial Latin, especially when his Latin successors Greekified epic later on. But perhaps it's not too surprising. Presumably, Livius Andronicus would have been self-conscious lest his audience question his command of Latin, a problem that the likes of Virgil or Catullus wouldn't have faced. And hence to the next word. Here the Latinity of Livius's text is typified by his reference not to a generic Greek musa, let alone the Greek epic goddess Calliope, but to a deity with a very Latin feel, Camena, a Latin river deity or deities associated perhaps with inspiration and loosely reminiscent of the Latin for song or poem Carmen, although I think that's just a happy coincidence rather than an etymological connection. And then the final word, and here's where it gets wild. In Homer, it's polutropon, the adjective modifying the opening word andra, man. So andra, polutropon, the man of many turns, now famously rendered by Emily Wilson as a complicated man. In Livius's text, this becomes vertum, from the verb vertere, to turn, close indeed to the Greek meaning, but also vertere can mean to convert or translate. In other words, tell me, Kamena, about a translated man. So with that we come to the end of Livius's first line. But Homer's first line continues, and here we come to the most notable difference between Homer and Livius's Odyssey. Language aside, the meter. Homer's line is in hexameters. Livius's line is in the Saturnian metre. Indeed, both the Odyssey and the Iliad were written in hexameters, and the general consensus is that the oral epic tradition from which they sprung would have been performed in hexameters for hundreds of years earlier or more, as indeed were all other ancient Greek epics, with few or no exceptions down to late antiquity monstrosities like Nonnus's 48-book Dionysica. But when Livius decided to remake the Odyssey into the first Latin epic, he forced the epic genre into the straitjacket of the now obscure Saturnian metre. The principles on which the hexameter is constructed are well known, but the principles on which the Saturnian metre was built have never been fully understood. Although some high-level principles can be inferred, each line is relatively short and has a hard break or caesura in the middle, thus comprising two subunits, or cola, the first of about 5 to 9 syllables, the second of about 5 to 8 syllables. Each colon, whilst not necessarily a complete standalone sentence, seems nonetheless to have comprised a unit of sense in its own right. Perhaps the Saturnian metre therefore required the poet to work with small units of sense, albeit affording a lot of flexibility within such discrete units. That would have been perfect for writing little ditties and prayers and little rituals, but it wouldn't have been a great vehicle for narrative poetry, unlike the Homeric hexameter, which tends to function in terms of 2 lines of hexameters, loosely, which generally form a complete sentence or action, with plenty of room for the narrative to develop, all whilst feeling artistically just right. One could also say, therefore, that unlike the Saturnian, the hexameter had evolved over hundreds of years as the vehicle for oral and then literary narrative epic. So, translating the Odyssey into this straitjacket of a Saturnian would have presented Livius with several challenges, and much of the commentary on his surviving verses focuses on how he achieved this, with mixed results. Goldberg is really good on this point. Here are the references. Livius's epic successor Naevius also wrote in Saturnians, but the metre was then scrapped for epic when Ennius adopted hexameters, a practice followed by Virgil and all the great or not so great Roman epicists thereafter. By the 1st century, Saturnians, once used for all manner of traditional Latin folk poetry, had fallen by the wayside and were seen as an old-time crusty cultural relic, prompting Horace to write, "Greece, the captive, made her savage victor captive, and brought the arts into rustic Latium. Thus the stream of that rude Saturnian measure ran dry, and good taste banished the offensive poison. Yet for many a year lived on, and still live on, traces of our rustic past." So, what caused Livius to adopt the Saturnian metre? Well, I guess, like the Latin language itself, it felt like the right thing to do, even though it may have been totally unsuited to the job. You see, if we can assume, as many but not everybody does, that the Saturnian verse form was a native Latin form and coded as traditional and old school by Livius's time, then his adoption of that metre would suit his programme of making epic Latin, adopting a patina of ancient Latin venerability in perhaps a misguided attempt to match the antiquity of Homeric verse. This tracks with the archaic register that Livius seems to have been aiming at with his vocabulary. Reading through fragments of Livius, a lot of words jumped out that were completely unfamiliar to me. My favourite word that I'd never heard of is topper. It looks so bizarre to me that when I read it the first time, I thought the Loeb website had glitched, But no, it's real. Here's Topper in context. Topper facit homines ut rossus fuerint. She, Topper, brought it about that they should become men again. Which broadly corresponds to Homer's Andres daps egenonto neoteroi eparos esan from Odyssey 10:395. She turned them into men again, but younger than before. Notice, of course, the longer hexameter. Now, no one is quite sure what Topper actually means. It's usually glossed to mean quickly or fast. Ivy Livingston has traced its uses down to a handful of examples in some archaic Latin authors, many of which I hadn't even heard of, and the usual given meaning of quickly just doesn't really fit all those circumstances. For example, in this other line from Livius, Topper, if it means quickly, would just be redundant. Topper citi ad aedis venimus cercae. Quickly, Topper, quickly, citi, we came to the house of Circe. Incidentally, this line, whilst clearly corresponding to the Circe episode in the Odyssey, doesn't seem to track any particular line from Homer. And there are several other instances of this, lines that don't seem to have an Homeric counterpart. Now, this lack of a precise Homeric parallel could be for one of several reasons. Perhaps Livius is giving a loose or non-literal translation of a particular passage, which would be fair. Perhaps he's translating a version of Homer that has now been lost. We should bear in mind that there was never a definitive edition of the Odyssey, not in ancient times, or indeed today. Around Livius's time, there would have been multiple versions of the text, which have left no trace in the surviving manuscript or papyrus tradition. Presumably, Livius would have been working from a single manuscript, which might have varied in quite some degree from those versions of the Odyssey that we're familiar with. Or indeed, perhaps Livius isn't even translating anything at this point. Which brings us back to the question I started with. What exactly is Livius's Odyssey? Is it what we would call a translation, an adaptation, or is it a remake? What's the purpose of it? This is far more complex than I propose to cover now, and Feeney is a really good source here. Feeney reminds us that we mustn't think of translations from Greek to Latin in the same way as we might think of a translation today, and the idea of a literary translation is not a universal. Also, in terms of the purpose, the cliched assumption used to be that Livius, being a former enslaved Greek tutor to some posh Roman kids, might have translated the Odyssey to help kids with their Greek. Or, more like modern translations, he might have been trying to make the Homeric Greek accessible to the Roman Latin elite. But that doesn't track if one assumes that educated Romans at the time were already by this stage reasonably fluent in Greek and could damn well read Homer in the original. And educational purposes just don't make sense to me anyway. How do you teach people to read Homer? By showing them the Greek, of course. Side note, whilst I say that the Romans were at this point probably quite fluent in Greek, or at least fluent enough to be able to read the Odyssey, there are, however, some really funny stories about Romans not being able to speak Greek from just a few years prior to Livius's time, including one incident in Livius's native Tarentum, where some Romans pissed off the locals with their bad Greek so much that the locals literally crapped all over them. To quote Appian, "It was only with great reluctance that the Tarentines admitted the Roman ambassadors to their council, and when they did, they mocked the Romans for the mistakes they made in the Greek language. They also mocked their toga with its purple border. Indeed, a man called Philonides, a comic and a joker, went up to Postumius, the leader of the Roman embassy, and, turning his back to him, hitched up his own clothes, bent over, and shit all over him." Now, here's my radical literary history theory. Maybe Livius, as a young boy in Tarentum, heard about his townsfolk crapping on the Romans, or perhaps he was even there in the crowd at the time. He was then enslaved by the Romans and sought his revenge in the way his townsfolk knew best, crapping all over the nascent Roman literary tradition. Now, that theory might not be 100% provable, but anyway, leaving aside such puerile suggestions, the point remains. It really wouldn't have made much sense for Livius to translate the Odyssey into bad Latin for utility's sake. Perhaps, if we are to ascribe a noble motive to him. He was indeed trying to kickstart a new Roman literature, something that had perhaps not existed before, although I find it weird that Roman heroic folk tales of the kind romantically reimagined by Macaulay in the 19th century didn't gain traction as a national grassroots epic tradition in their own right. Perhaps the Romans were too busy conquering and administering others to bother cultivating their own folk literary traditions, and needed a Greek speaker to kick off the tradition that would later give rise to Ennius, Virgil, and those guys. One further, albeit trivial point to note is that there's a view, originating I think in Aulus Gellius' reference to a single volume, that Livius' Odyssey may have been substantially shorter than Homer's Odyssey, an abridgment therefore. But an abridgment in a different language from the original, that's no longer a translation at all, that's an adaptation. Either which way, I'm tending towards actually sticking by my silly description of the Odyssey as a remake after all. And since Odyssey movies are on everybody's mind right now, perhaps a remake is a good way to think about this. It's not a translation in the sense of your typical Loeb or Penguin classics. It's a literary artifact in itself, albeit of doubted quality. It's really not too dissimilar from the concept of a, albeit bad, remake of a movie. But anyway, what's your take? Livius Andronicus' Odyssey. Translation, adaptation, remake, or something else? What's the point? Let me know in the comments. Meantime, like and subscribe, and we'll be back soon with more Odyssey adjacent material.